sweeping meta-ethical claims that philosophers working in this Humean, neo-Humean tradition typically endorse. I mean, don't just typically, they do. This is a subjectivistic interpretation of morality, of moral norms. All right? That Humeans tend, right? If you look at the history of philosophy, the Kantians are clearly objectivists. They give us an objectivistic account of moral judgment, right? Whereas the Humeans are giving us a much more of a subjectivist account, depending on feeling, right? There is no supersensible order of morality, right? It all comes down to how humans feel among one another. So, in a planet without persons, however teeming with sentient but non-deliberative and non-reflective life, there will be goods and bads, but no morality. No right and wrong, no justice, no duties, no rights. Moral sentiment is simply an emotional and evaluative attitude toward persons or their institutions. Okay? The challenge of relying on Hume's account of moral reasoning to support an ethic directed toward non-sentient and non-reflective entities in nature. Right? That Partridge says that this is a challenge that Collicutt tries to take up, but ultimately he can't because he's entrapped within this fundamentally, unavoidably anthropocentric moral psychology that Hume bequeaths to us. So, Partridge asks, why does the clear-cutting of a primeval forest, the damming of a wild river, or the extinction of a species violate a normative environmental ethic on Hume's account? Okay? Why? If there are moral wrongs, we must show that the agents responsible have done something wrong to persons. All right? And yet, clear-cutting, damming, slaughtering dolphins, etc., are almost always done on behalf of other persons. We don't do these things, to hurt other people. We do them to help other people, right? Other human beings. Hume's moral sentiments originate in interpersonal relationships. Personhood is the source and limit of moral sentiments. Thus, the Humean ethicist will seem to favor the logger over his family over the old-growth forest, the Taiji fisherman over the dolphins, the utility company and the barge company over the salmon run. Right? If we're stuck in Humean moral sentiments, right, they're all related to other human beings. That's how they develop. They don't develop in relationship to ecological wholes. That would be crazy, wouldn't it? You say humans evolved the ability to objectively love an old-growth forest? No, if we're sticking with evolution and if our explanation of morality is that morality evolved as a tool for long-term human survival, then it would make no sense at all to say that humans can recognize moral status in an old-growth forest, right? Moral status in and of itself, right? There might be something moral about it, but it's all based on humans, right? Because it's our long-term interest that morality is concerned with, okay? So again, Hume seems to throw us back onto this anthropocentric ethic. And it seems like if we want to rely on David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, perhaps we have to settle for what's now become quite familiar to all of you, which is a compelling ethic about how it's important to protect natural resources, but an ethic that in the end is rooted in long-term human enlightened interests, right? Long-term human interests, not the interests of the ecosystem itself. Okay, so is that really an environmental ethic? That's not. It's really a humanistic ethic that just recognizes that we got to take care of the earth to have strong, healthy human beings and to have any kind of a future, right? Which is good, right? That's a major step forward, but is it quite an environmental ethic yet? Many environmental ethicists say no, it can't be, because environmental ethicists are perhaps at heart, many of them are deeply concerned about providing an account of ecological wholes that makes plausible the idea that they have moral status in themselves, right? And evidently, if Partridge is right, then Hume, and we'll pick up some more of this after we read Milstein. Okay, so next Tuesday, you'll understand this kind of criticism of Collicutt's Leopold a little better. All right. So what Partridge is saying is that Humean moral sentiment is an inadequate basis for a real land ethic, and it can't be it can't really be what Leopold had in mind. And by the way, Leopold never, in all the thousands of pages of Leopold's writing, he never uses the word David Hume. He might have studied Hume, for 1 week in some undergraduate philosophy class. But, you know, Collicutt's really stretching quite a bit. So Partridge comes along and says, in a planet without persons, this is just another way of, you know, explaining what's wrong with relying on Humean moral psychology to construct a land ethic. In a planet without persons, however teeming with sentient but non-deliberative and non-reflective life, there will be, this is a quote that I had on a previous page. All right, so some of this is duplicative. In fact, that's all it is. Ernest Partridge concludes that Humean moral sentiment is a poor theoretical stream in which to fish for a land ethic. All right? Our hearts do reach out naturally to our fellow human beings because this is how morality evolved in humans. Our hearts do not reach out in the same manner to inanimate objects or natural communities. We are not equipped, for example, to feel kinship with the stream in the same strong way that brings forth a sense of moral obligations, right? That we feel kinship with other human beings. Because you all reciprocate, right? And that's a huge difference, isn't it? Is that enough of a difference to say that, well, that's why. We all reciprocate. You all understand English. You all understand the notion of rights. You all understand that if you go rob the convenience store over there, then there's a good chance that you'll be apprehended and that you'll be incarcerated or arrested and be deeply embarrassed, right, and humiliated in the community, right? So you don't do that. You realize that your rights are negotiable. You realize that your actions can nullify your rights, right? Those are all sophisticated cognitive operations that we humans can do. And yet, not even a dolphin, as far as we know, until we develop more sophisticated ways of communicating with dolphins and really understanding, you know, we can't say for sure. They very well might understand the notion of rights and reciprocation and all that. They don't hurt us. I mean, they watch out for us when we're out in the ocean, so maybe they think, okay, man, we violate these guys' rights and they'll be able to incarcerate us. I mean, who knows? Who knows what they're actually thinking? But we don't share their language, so really humans are the only ones that we can confirm as being reciprocal agents. Okay? And reciprocity seems to be a minimum condition for the emergence of a moral obligation on David Hume's account. Okay? So what we need, guess what we need according to Partridge? We need a non-moral sentiment that will support a sense, something like a sense of obligation to the stream. And it has to be a non-moral sentiment because moral sentiments are unavoidably anthropocentric, right? So that's just enigmatic, and that's one reason that Partridge's essay is so is a little bit more difficult. Milstein's much easier to understand. But guess what? Partridge has a suggestion for what he calls a non-moral sentiment that can be used to explain. You might ask, well, if it's a non-moral sentiment, then how on earth can it explain an environmental ethic? And actually, what I think he's getting, where we go if you develop this idea, is he's getting at an environmental aesthetic. And a non-moral sentiment like biophilia. If it's not a moral sentiment, what kind of sentiment is it? It's an aesthetic sentiment. It's the kind of sentiment that you feel in the presence of a great work of art or just a majestic, you know, old-growth forest, right? Or looking out at Mount Hood on a sunny day, right? It's an aesthetic delight rather than a sense of moral obligation. Or it's an aesthetic delight that then leads to a sense of moral obligation, biophilia. But Partridge steals this word with due credit to, after pointing out what I pointed out, that E.O. Wilson's sociobiology, you know, is a little bit of a crackpot theory. But he still, you know, acknowledges that E.O. Wilson's term biophilia is a really, really valuable contribution to environmental ethics. And, all right, so biophilia as a non-moral but still motivational sentiment. All right, and this may be the trick to resurrecting some kind of Humean defense of the notion that ecological wholes have moral status, something like, right? They have aesthetic status, and that aesthetic status should lead us to give them more legal protection than we give them, than we tend to give them. Perhaps. All right, anyway, so biophilia, again, to review, it could be characterized as wonder, delight, serenity, awe, humility, fear, directed at impersonal forces and beings and events in nature. And the biophilia hypothesis suggests that biophilic gratification is essential for long-term mental and physical health. It's an empirical claim, right? It's an empirical hypothesis probably untestable and unprovable, but it's tantalizing nevertheless. It's real squishy, and if you're a more rigorous philosopher, then you can just get up and leave. No, I mean, throw all this isn't philosophy, damn it, what's this biophilia stuff? It's totally untestable. It's not even science, right? What is it? It's just new agey stuff, Anyway. So health is a moral norm, though, for not just for humans, but for all living things. Once you start talking about the moral value of health, then you're really talking about something that all living beings share. And so you're kind of at that boundary line again. That's why I like to put the biophiles right up next to the dotted line, right? Because they're just right up here in the edge. They're in the border regions, right? Between... And one thing that they're saying too is that humans, that biophilia is a biological function that's shared with all other animals. And the point also made by Albert Schweitzer, right? Reverence for life is shared. Humans crystallize it, conceptualize it, right? They turn it into this beautiful concept, reverence for life. But as a feeling, it pervades all living beings. As, with these cheesy little examples that some of you, rightly scoffed at. About the geese, the geese waiting so their friend would grow his feathers back, so they could all travel together. Even though it meant that they had to stick around an extra 2 weeks, right? They did it because they had reverence for life. They did it because they had biophilia, right? Perhaps. By recognizing in others the biophilic need for nature that we feel in ourselves, we may be moved through human benevolence to preserve nature for all and for posterity. I think it's, I'm not even sure if it's Partridge who writes about the paradox of eco-morality, but somehow this point ended up down there. The nature lover's life is enhanced to the degree that she cares. This is, I've also heard the lover's paradox, which would apply here too. Someone who really loves another human being will treat that other human being as much more important than him or herself. But then the paradox of that is that the result is that the person who regards his or her lover as more important than his or herself ends up flourishing more than the person who doesn't do that. And it's the same with eco-morality, with the earth. Only if we genuinely treat the natural environment with respect and restraint, finding and cherishing therein values we regard as intrinsic, can we flourish in the environment and deserve to do so. As soon as we begin to ask, well, what's in it for me, right? As soon as you begin to ask that of your love relationship, or of whether it's with another human being or whether it's with some beautiful place. As soon as you ask, what's in it for me or what's in it for us humans, the game is lost and we fall out of grace, right? So perhaps biophilia can be thought of as the sentimental underpinning of a Humean environmental ethic. Non-moral psychological equipment. There may be a fundamental genetic basis for sentiments of love and respect for the land. If you haven't gotten your any reading summaries back from last week or the week before, then I have some over here. All right. I was also going to make sure. Did I have any management topics today? What was scheduled on our syllabus? No. Okay. All right, but I do have these questions identified on my syllabus that I'm supposed to address during today's lecture. In what sense are ecological wholes more than anthropocentrically valuable, according to Collicutt? In what sense do ecological wholes have independent moral status, according to Collicutt? All right, so that's a very important question that will take me some time to cover. So yes, go ahead, please.
So can you go back a slide? So for biophilia, can you just argue that humans have evolved to see natural resources and be affiliated towards them, seeing that I can exploit them. And so if I saw like this beautiful, majestic landscape and be like, hey, this is a good spot for me to reproduce and do all those things. So that would be the trigger, saying awe or any other good natured feeling towards it. And that because now we're at this point where we can survive in environments that may look a bit desecrated, that seeing these other places that look lively, that's the only reason we see awe in any beautiful place.
Yeah.
So it's still be human-centric.
Yes. And I think, I don't know about, well, Wilson, as you know, the guy that coins the concept of biophilia, is totally, unabashedly anthropocentric, right? He just says flat out, this is a selfish ethic because selfish ethics are the only ones that actually move people, right? But I want to deepen, I want to expose the deeper selfishness that humans have. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to point to this genetic endowment, I hypothesize this genetic endowment that all humans have, of biophilia.
Right.
And that deepens their selfish motives. Yeah. But again, that's not even an environmental ethic, is it?
Right. Okay.
So, all right. So, what is this last point? Get a little bit teary-eyed, perhaps. Philia means love, right? Love of life. Biophilia is love of life, and it's so it's tragic to think that the development of our understanding of our role in the world has taken hundreds of years to get to where we are today, where we have a lot of appreciation for biodiversity. And 150 years ago, our ancestors just didn't give a crap. They didn't care at all, right? The people on the Falkland Islands who saw those Falkland Island wolves, right? The only mammal on the whole island. It didn't even occur to them. They didn't stop for 1 second to think about anything valuable about that animal. The animal was a varmint, and that was that. And they exterminated. And when the last one was dead, they had a party, right? And then they totally forgot about it. Same thing, with the thylacines. But that was 50 years later. By then, people were starting to get a little bit aware, right? And lo and behold, Darwin had sunk into the culture, right? Darwin, by the 1930s, the influence of Darwinism was pretty deep, and along with that influence of Darwinism comes an appreciation for biodiversity, for the natural world. But by then it was too late, right? And those poor people, it's still on their crest, the Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine. There's a cute little some kind of tourism promotional video from 1964. It's just ridiculous. But they show these. They show this tourist couple going around, and they have all this curiosity. I don't know if I found it. Anyway, it's just kind of cheesy, but it reminds you of how the people in Tasmania and Australia in general revered this animal, and they have him on their flag, right, or their state seal. I'm not sure which one. I thought I could find that movie. Maybe I should put Tasmanian tiger. I would not want to be related to anybody who was responsible for, geez, man, the national guilt that they must have. But it was progress, right? Progress. Got rid of those varmints. All right, I couldn't find it. Anyway, if anyone's interested, go take a look. Go take a look. The state seal or the state flag of Tasmania has one of these thylacines. He's standing up on his hind legs, like they're very good at standing on their hind legs. I think because their tails are so heavy, they use their tail to kind of balance themselves. Anyway, but I want to take some time now to go over this tantalizing move that, remember now, that's kind of a meta-ethical question. But remember now, okay, I don't really need to have this up here anymore, I don't think. Well, maybe I should go back some of these earlier slides from Tuesday. You remember we did these, I had these pages of notes on the difference between Norton's interpretation of Leopold and Collicutt's interpretation of Leopold. Collicutt insists, right? And remember their philosophical ancestry is the same. Okay? They both admire David Hume and Adam Smith, and they think David Hume and Adam Smith's account of moral philosophy and their account of moral psychology is just a very good place to start doing moral reasoning. Okay? Both Norton and the pragmatists, right? Norton's a pragmatist, an environmental pragmatist, and Collicutt, this ecocentrist, share the same Humean philosophical ancestry. They're both long-sighted consequentialists, okay? Both Norton and Collicutt, and they think Leopold, that's what Leopold was. They're both obviously holistic, but whereas Norton is still a garden variety anthropocentric thinker, Collicutt presents himself as a more than anthropocentric thinker, and he insists that Leopold too should be understood as a more than anthropocentric thinker. All right? In other words, Collicutt's Leopold is a thinker who attributes moral status, direct, independent moral status to ecological wholes, right? To wolf ecosystems with wolves in them, right? For example, which is an exotic move, okay? And so we have to ask ourselves, how on earth does Collicutt, what does he mean when he suggests, okay, so first of all, Collicutt uses the term inherent value, and it's a fine point, it's not the term intrinsic value that's favored by some other environmental ethicists. And Collicutt makes a big deal out of this distinction between inherent, what he calls inherent value and intrinsic value. This is what Collicutt thinks is happening when we attribute moral status to an ecological whole. Let's just say the mineral King Valley has ecological status, and that's why they didn't build a ski resort there, right? Or the orcas in Puget Sound have moral status, and we're obligated to restore them to a certain percentage of their historic population. And Collicutt would say, yes, they do have moral status. Ecological wholes, like and communities have moral status. But their moral status is not something that exists independently of human culture. Okay? So when Collicutt says that a wolf pack has a right to exist and flourish because of its inherent value to the ecosystem and its inherent moral status. When Collicutt says that a wolf pack has inherent moral status, what he's saying is that humans, through biology and ecology, through their enlightened understanding of what's going on in an ecosystem, confer that moral status onto the wolf packs. And they didn't have it to begin with, and that's the difference between intrinsic value. So Collicutt's arguing not that the wolf pack is intrinsically valuable in the sense that it would be morally valuable even if humans aren't there or not. Human consciousness for Collicutt, because he's a Darwinist and a consequentialist, he has to acknowledge that human consciousness is necessary to actualize the inherent value of a wolf pack. Okay? So, unlike our friend Kevin in the back, who has moral status intrinsically, under Collicutt's view, the wolf pack does not. So, if we treated Kevin as nothing more than a resource for social benefit, then we would have to conclude, then obviously we would not consider, right? So, for example, if, let's say, 1,000 humans could be saved by harvesting Kevin's genetic material, in a utilitarian society, right? Let's say we set a threshold, there has to be at least 999 people whose lives are going to be saved before we can involuntarily harvest, right? And it would involve killing Kevin to harvest his genetic material to save 1,000 people. In a utilitarian society, if we had good utilitarian legislators, damn it, what's wrong with our utilitarian legislators? How come they haven't passed a law like that yet, right? Come on, man, we got all these sick people out there. Kevin has this amazing genetic material. He can cure a whole range. But they need all of his. They need all of his cells. So they have to kill him, right? They have to grind him up and kill him, make this kind of a serum that they inject in people who have all these different illnesses. But his genes are so valuable, right? He can save 1,000 people who have all these different illnesses, right? Save their lives. And furthermore, science has determined that any future contributions that Kevin might make to society are negligible. Okay? So it makes perfect sense, right? If we're utilitarians, to sacrifice Kevin in order to save 1,000 people, right? But Kevin has intrinsic value. Kevin has universal human rights. Okay? So this could never happen, right? Our legislators could never pass such a law in our legal tradition, our legal and moral philosophical tradition. Because we all have intrinsic human rights. I think even if Kevin consented to this, I don't think, we would allow it. But if Kevin was a chimpanzee or somebody else, a tree, a wolf, a deer, we wouldn't skip a beat. We wouldn't think about it. It would be a no-brainer. Obviously, we're going to sacrifice the non-human to save all those humans, right? So, but what the more than anthropocentrist is saying is that some non-human entities, perhaps all ecological wholes, some species, who knows what's going to be included there. But some non-human entities have moral status of a kind analogous to the moral status we know that Kevin enjoys. Okay? Which means that their destruction, the destruction of those ecological wholes that have that kind of moral status, is going to be morally wrong, regardless of social benefit, okay? Regardless of thousands and thousands of humans that might be benefited, okay? So it's a very strong kind of an argument. It's what we use, it's the kind of argument we use to explain why we can't just willy-nilly harvest people's organs and, right? No matter, we can't justify it. It doesn't fit in our tradition of human rights. It doesn't fit, right? It's just absolute standard that we have. And that's the kind of absolute standard that some of these more exotic environmental ethicists are insisting that we ought to use when we think about land management decisions. Okay? We ought to attribute some similar, not that strong, but something along those lines, where we're not just constantly compromising our ecological wholes because, well, we have to, because all these people rely on these dams, et cetera, right? Because once you start going down that line, right, woe to those who creep through the serpent windings of utilitarianism, right? We got to keep doing all this. We got to keep all these roads going. We got to keep all these cars going. We got to keep digging more and more fossil fuels out of the ground underneath the oceans, right? We got to turn the entire planet into a sacrifice zone. Because, why? Because we got all these people depending on the economy, right? Jobs and cars and fossil, you need all that stuff. So, utilitarians can justify all manner of excesses, it would seem, based on social expediency. All right, so what Collicutt is saying, though, okay? Let's compare what Collicutt's saying about an ecological whole to what Collicutt might have to say about the emergence of the idea that human children have rights. Okay? Historians, there are histories of childhood, which are fascinating. not a person's childhood, but in histories of the concept of childhood. And historians inform us that the idea that children are independent of their parents and have their own set of rights didn't even occur to people until a couple hundred years ago, right? So historically, it's true that children were property, okay, and parents could dispose of them however they wanted. They could sell them to the textile mill or the sweatshop, etc. They could do all kinds of things, and there were no legal repercussions. Children weren't protected, right? And then somewhere in the 18th, 19th centuries, I don't know the history, so don't quote me on this, but at some point, children began to be viewed as having independent moral status. And governments began being understood as having responsibilities to protect children, right? If children are being harmed, parents can't just do whatever they want. The parents are withholding medical treatment or doing some bizarre rituals with their children that physically harms them, then by golly, we want agents of the government to go down and knock down that door if they have to protect those children, right? Because they have their own independent moral status. So how did this happen, right? Well, the common story is that children, before, society was dumb and ignorant, right, and backwards, and we just didn't recognize that children have direct moral status, but they do, right? And it was just society's error that kept going along, through the momentum and the inertia of institutional history. We just happened to keep treating children this way, but it was wrong the whole time. And now we're enlightened, and now we treat them like what they are, independently valuable entities, right? And we give them we accord them their rights, which they had all along, right? So it was our mistake. And they were illuminated from within by their universal human rights all along, right? We just didn't recognize. Same story when it came to African American slaves. Same story when it came to women. Same story when it came to Native Americans. Same story when it came to Asian people. Asian people couldn't even testify. I don't think anybody except white men could testify in a courtroom, right? Up until the early 20th century. It was a little more than 100 years ago. If you were a Chinese immigrant, and you witnessed a murder, and you wouldn't even be allowed to talk in court, right? Because your word was totally worthless. Anyway, but we were wrong, right? That's the story we tell ourselves. We were wrong, and now we're right. Now we understand, okay? So, but what is this story that Leopold, according to Collicutt, is telling us about ecological wholes? Is it, and how did children get rights? Collicutt, it seems, if we're going to extend his analysis of how ecological wholes got rights, by culture conferring, right? By cultural conferral, by humans conferring. Because humans understand scientifically the complex relationships between what we do and the environment, right? But not until we understand, right, our community interrelationships with land, air, water, wildlife, does the light go on and we confer inherent value, right? That's Collicutt's account. So is that how he would explain children too? Or African Americans, or women, or Native Americans, or Asian people? Is that how he would explain? Right?